The Calloway mansion was a place of splendor, marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, walls lined with priceless art, and rooms filled with furniture so delicate it seemed more like decoration than something to be used. Margaret had spent years moving through those grand halls with silent efficiency, dusting, scrubbing, and polishing every surface until it sparkled. She had become a fixture in the house, a presence so constant and discreet that the Calloways hardly noticed her anymore. She was simply Margaret the maid, never Margaret the woman, the mother, the person with dreams and struggles of her own. Raising her teenage son Daniel on a maid's wages had been no easy feat. Margaret often found herself exhausted after long hours, but she never let it show. She worked tirelessly, making sure he had everything he needed: good school supplies, home-cooked meals, and a warm bed to sleep in, even if their apartment was modest and far from the lavish life she witnessed daily at the mansion. Daniel was the reason she endured the long hours and dismissive glances. He was her motivation to keep going, to hope for a better future, even if it felt far out of reach. One particular evening, after a grueling day of preparing the mansion for yet another high-profile event, Margaret found herself in the vast, gleaming kitchen, putting away the last of the silverware. The Calloways were hosting their annual charity gala, an event that brought in politicians, business moguls, and celebrities. It was the kind of affair where everything had to be perfect, where the food had to be exquisite, the decorations flawless, and the staff invisible. As Margaret wiped down the marble countertops, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation drifting from the grand dining room. "A Fortune 500 CEO will be here," Mrs. Calloway's excited voice carried through the air. "We must ensure everything is impeccable." "And the governor's wife, she's particularly observant," added Mr. Calloway. "No mistakes this year." Margaret sighed, used to such conversations. The Calloways were meticulous, and she knew their standards well. Still, she found it hard to ignore the sting of being treated like part of the decor rather than a human being. The gala preparations went on around her like clockwork, and she remained the silent gear turning in the background. That night, after finishing her shift, Margaret sat on the worn-out couch in her small living room, staring at the invitation she had swiped from the trash earlier that day. It was beautifully embossed, the kind of thing she imagined rich people saved as keepsakes. She traced the gold lettering with her finger, feeling a pang of longing. For years she had cleaned up after these lavish parties, seen the expensive gowns and tailored suits, and watched the guests drink champagne as if it were water. And yet she had never been more than a shadow, always just beyond the glamorous life that paraded in front of her eyes. Daniel walked into the room, his eyebrows raised in curiosity. "What's that, Mom?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Just an invitation to the Calloways' big event tomorrow. Nothing we'd ever be invited to, of course." Daniel plopped down beside her and studied the card. "Why not? You practically run that place." Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. "Not exactly. People like us, we stay in the background. That's how it works." Daniel frowned but didn't argue. He had seen the exhaustion in his mother's eyes too many times to challenge the way things were. But something about the gala gnawed at Margaret that night. She thought about the years of dedication, the birthdays missed because she was working late, and the countless times she had gone unnoticed. For once, she wanted to step out of the shadows, even if just for a moment. The following evening, the mansion was transformed into a wonderland of twinkling lights, elegant floral arrangements, and soft classical music wafting through the air. Margaret, dressed in her usual uniform, bustled through the kitchen with the other staff, ensuring every canapé was perfect and every glass was sparkling. The guests began arriving, stepping out of luxury cars in gowns that shimmered under the chandeliers. As she passed by the grand staircase, Margaret caught sight of Mrs. Calloway in her floor-length gown, smiling and greeting the guests with effortless charm. Margaret straightened her apron and reminded herself to keep moving, but a voice in her head whispered, "What if just for once you didn't?" Margaret's life had been about blending in, about making sure others shone while she remained in the background, but tonight, something felt different. Little did anyone know, before the night was over, Margaret would no longer be just another maid at the Calloway mansion. The course of her life was about to change in a way she never could have imagined. The night of the gala had arrived, and the Calloway mansion was alive with dazzling lights, elegant music, and the murmur of wealthy guests mingling in their finest attire. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hors d'oeuvres, and the clinking of champagne glasses punctuated the lively chatter. The mansion, adorned with twinkling chandeliers and luxurious decor, was the epitome of extravagance. Margaret moved silently through the crowd, her uniform crisp and her hands expertly tending to every detail unnoticed by the high society guests. She adjusted table settings, picked up stray napkins, and ensured that every request was met with efficiency and grace. It was a night like so many before, her presence acknowledged only when something needed to be done. Despite the exhaustion from a long day of preparation, she took pride in her work. She watched from the sidelines as the Calloways basked in the glory of their well-connected lives, completely unaware that fate was about to test them all. As Margaret carried a fresh stack of linens toward the laundry room, she paused for a moment. Something was off. A faint but distinct smell of smoke tickled her nose. She glanced around, but everything seemed normal. The guests continued laughing, their conversations growing louder as the night progressed. But the smell persisted, nagging at her instincts. Curiosity turned to alarm as Margaret followed the faint scent down the corridor leading to the upper floors. The further she went, the stronger it became, accompanied by a thin haze creeping along the edges of the hallway. Her heart pounded as she quickened her pace, climbing the grand staircase 2 steps at a time. When she reached the nursery door, the room where little Oliver, the Calloway's 5-year-old son, was sleeping, her chest tightened with fear. Smoke curled out from beneath the door, and when she tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her veins. She pounded on the door. "Oliver? Oliver, sweetheart? Can you hear me?" No answer came except the faint sound of whimpering from inside. Margaret's hands trembled, but there was no time to think. She grabbed a heavy decorative chair from the hallway and, with all her strength, smashed it against the door. Once, twice. Finally, the lock gave way, and the door burst open with a crash. The sight inside stole the breath from her lungs. Flames licked hungrily at the curtains and crept toward the crib, where Oliver cowered under his blanket, tears streaming down his frightened face. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Margaret didn't hesitate. She rushed to the crib, yanking the child into her arms and wrapping him in a blanket to shield him from the choking smoke and blistering heat. "Hold on tight, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice strained as she staggered back toward the door. The fire roared behind them, spreading rapidly, but Margaret focused on nothing except getting Oliver to safety. Her lungs burned, each breath a struggle, but she pressed on, fighting through the growing inferno. By the time Margaret reached the grand staircase, the fire alarm blared throughout the mansion, piercing through the chaos. The once festive atmosphere had transformed into sheer panic. Guests in shimmering gowns and expensive suits scrambled toward the exits, their faces twisted with fear and confusion. Flames flickered ominously at the edges of the elegant decor, consuming the grandeur of the mansion with ruthless speed. Margaret's knees buckled as she reached the foot of the staircase, gasping for air, her arms still tightly wrapped around Oliver. The little boy sobbed into her shoulder, his tiny hands clutching her uniform with all the strength he could muster. The cool night air rushed in as someone flung open the main doors, letting in a wave of relief. Suddenly, Mrs. Calloway's shrill scream pierced through the commotion. "Oliver, my baby!" She and Mr. Calloway pushed through the crowd, their eyes wide with terror. They reached for their son, barely sparing a glance at Margaret, their focus entirely on the trembling child in her arms. Margaret handed Oliver over gently, her body shaking from the adrenaline and the heat of the flames still raging behind them. "Is he okay? Is he hurt?" Mrs. Calloway demanded, examining Oliver with frantic hands, pressing kisses to his tear-streaked face. "He's safe," Margaret said hoarsely, coughing violently. I got to him just in time." Mr. Calloway finally looked at Margaret, his face pale but composed. "Thank you," he said stiffly, as though the words tasted foreign in his mouth. But before Margaret could respond, they turned away, cradling Oliver between them, moving swiftly toward the paramedics who had just arrived. Margaret sat on the cool marble floor, her chest rising and falling in labored breaths. Around her, the mansion was in chaos, firefighters rushing in with hoses, staff huddled together in shock, and guests spilling onto the manicured lawns, clutching their phones and expensive handbags. Despite the chaos, no one seemed to acknowledge Margaret's heroism. To them, she was still just part of the staff, a silent figure blending into the background, her exhaustion and bravery invisible. But Margaret didn't need their recognition. She had saved Oliver's life, and that was enough for her. As she sat there, catching her breath, she allowed herself a small smile. In the midst of luxury and extravagance, she had proven something greater than wealth: courage, love, and the strength that came from being true to herself. And even though the Calloways might never truly see her, Margaret knew she had done something that no amount of money could ever match. The days following the fire were a whirlwind of flashing cameras, reporters swarming outside the gates, and headlines that praised the Calloways for their resilience. News outlets fixated on Oliver's miraculous escape, celebrating the family's strength and how they were heroically coping with the near tragedy. Pictures of Mrs. Calloway holding Oliver tightly, tears streaming down her face, graced magazine covers and social media posts. The Calloways were hailed as loving parents who had triumphed over a terrifying ordeal. Margaret, however, was little more than a footnote in the grand narrative that had unfolded. Her role in Oliver's rescue was barely mentioned, reduced to a passing comment in an article that referred to her as a staff member who acted quickly. No name, no credit, just an anonymous figure who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Among the staff, whispers circulated. Some were in awe of what she had done, while others muttered dismissively, "She was just doing her job." The dismissive remarks stung more than Margaret cared to admit. Despite her aching body and the memories of the suffocating smoke still fresh in her mind, Margaret returned to her usual duties without any acknowledgement from the Calloways. The mansion had resumed its daily rhythm, floors to be polished, silverware to be shined, and meals to be prepared. The fire, though still lingering in scorched curtains and lingering ash in the air, seemed to have been swept under the rug as far as her employers were concerned. Mrs. Calloway barely glanced in her direction as she walked past Margaret in the grand hallway. Mr. Calloway remained engrossed in calls, dealing with insurance and damage control for the mansion. Not a single thank you was offered, no moment of recognition for the woman who had risked everything to save their son. Margaret swallowed her disappointment, her back aching as she scrubbed the grand dining room table, as if trying to erase the bitterness building inside her. At home, things weren't much better. Bills stacked up higher than ever: electricity, rent, Daniel's school fees. Her hands trembled as she sorted through them, exhaustion weighing down her every movement. Daniel, always perceptive, sat beside her on the couch. "Mom," he said gently, "why aren't they talking about you on the news? You saved that boy's life." Margaret forced a tired smile and ruffled his hair. "People like us don't get noticed, sweetheart. That's just how it is." But deep inside, she wondered, was her sacrifice invisible? Would it always be like this? Had all those years of blending into the background conditioned her to expect nothing? But Margaret didn't know that someone had been watching closely. Late one evening, after finishing another long shift at the mansion, she stepped out to find an unfamiliar car parked outside the service entrance. A well-dressed man in his 50s with kind but sharp eyes stood waiting. He approached her with an air of quiet authority. "Margaret, right?" he asked, offering a small smile. Margaret hesitated, clutching her purse tighter. "Yes. Can I help you?" He extended his hand. "My name's Henry Whitmore. I was a guest at the Calloway Gala that night." She recognized him now, a prominent philanthropist who had been on the guest list. "I saw what you did," he continued, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "You saved that boy's life. You didn't hesitate. That took incredible courage." Margaret blinked, unsure of how to respond. No one had spoken to her like this since the fire. "I was just doing what anyone would," she said softly, the familiar words rolling off her tongue. Henry shook his head. "No, Margaret. Not everyone would. I've seen people freeze in fear, hesitate, or worse, walk away. But you acted, and that makes you extraordinary." For the first time in days, Margaret felt seen, truly seen. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Henry reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "I run a non-profit that helps people like you, those who go unnoticed but deserve better. If you're interested, I'd love to talk about opportunities beyond cleaning mansions." Margaret stared at the card, the weight of its possibilities sinking in. For years, she had accepted invisibility as her reality, but maybe, just maybe, there was something more waiting for her. A week had passed since the fire, and Margaret had resigned herself to the idea that her act of bravery would remain an unspoken part of the Calloway mansion's history, just another forgotten effort among the countless hours of labor she had poured into the grand estate. So when she was summoned to Mr. Calloway's private study, she felt an anxious weight settle in her chest. Walking through the lavish corridors, she couldn't help but think about all the years she had spent here, quietly ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Now, as she stood before the heavy oak doors of the study, she smoothed down her uniform and took a deep breath before stepping inside. Mr. Calloway sat behind his large mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. Margaret had never been invited into his private space before. The air smelled of expensive leather and polished wood, the dim lighting casting soft shadows around the room. She swallowed nervously, expecting a quick acknowledgement and perhaps a handshake before being sent back to her duties. "Margaret, please have a seat," Mr. Calloway said, gesturing to the plush chair in front of him. She sat stiffly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting. He studied her for a moment before reaching into a drawer and placing a small velvet box on the desk. Her eyes flickered to it, confusion knitting her brow. Before she could ask, he slid a crisp document across the table. "We've been thinking about what you did for Oliver," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard before. "You didn't just save his life. You gave us something we can never repay." Margaret hesitated before reaching for the box, her fingers trembling slightly. She lifted the lid to reveal a delicate gold necklace with a locket. The intricate design shimmered under the soft light, and with careful fingers, she opened it. Inside was a small photo of her and Daniel, taken secretly by Oliver during one of the rare moments Margaret had brought him to work. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She traced the tiny image with her thumb, her chest tightening with emotion. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat, bringing her attention back to the document. "This," he said, tapping it gently, "is something we hope will show how grateful we truly are." Margaret scanned the paper, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a scholarship fund, an irrevocable trust in Daniel's name, covering his education through college. The numbers on the page blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. She looked up at Mr. Calloway, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." Mr. Calloway leaned back in his chair, his expression surprisingly earnest. "You've given so much to this family, Margaret, more than we've ever acknowledged. This is just a small way of saying thank you. We know we can't repay you for what you did, but we hope this can change your life the way you changed ours." Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the document to her chest. Her mind raced with thoughts of Daniel's future, his dreams of becoming an architect, the sleepless nights she had spent worrying about how she'd afford his education. And now, here it was. A future she had only dared to dream about, placed before her in black and white. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away, feeling a mix of overwhelming gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." Mr. Calloway gave a small nod, a flicker of something genuine in his usually reserved demeanor. "No, Margaret, thank you." As she left the study, Holding the velvet box and the life-changing document in her hands, she felt an unfamiliar sense of validation. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, acknowledged, not just as a maid, but as a mother, a protector, a hero. When she returned home that evening, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, his nose buried in a textbook. He looked up with a tired smile. "Hey, Mom. Long day?" Margaret sat down across from him, her heart swelling with emotion. "A good day," she said, sliding the document toward him. "A really good day." Daniel's eyes widened as he read through the details, his mouth falling open in shock. "Mom, this means I can go to college? All of it? You did this?" Margaret smiled, brushing his curls affectionately. "We did this. Together." He launched himself into her arms, hugging her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Mom." Margaret held him close, feeling the weight of years of struggle and sacrifice finally lifting. "And I'm proud of us," she whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek. As they sat there, Margaret realized that her act of bravery had given them more than just security. It had given them hope. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret believed that the best was yet to come. Margaret's life took a turn she had never imagined. For years, she had been consumed by the daily grind of cleaning, serving, and making ends meet. But now, with the weight of financial uncertainty lifted, she finally had the chance to dream. Really dream. With Daniel's education secured, she could focus on something she had long pushed aside, her own aspirations. In the evenings, after long days at the Calloway mansion, Margaret enrolled in hospitality management courses at the local community college. The first time she stepped into the classroom, she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness, but as the weeks went on, she found herself thriving. Concepts she had unknowingly mastered through years of experience, attention to detail, organization, and customer service, were now tools she could refine and use to build something more meaningful for her future. Daniel, once uncertain about what lay ahead for him, now spoke with excitement and confidence about becoming an architect. With the scholarship covering his tuition, he pored over architectural magazines and stayed up late working on designs, eager to turn his childhood passion into reality. Margaret watched him with pride, knowing that the struggles they had faced together had shaped him into a determined young man. One evening, after a particularly long day at the mansion, Margaret was walking down the hall when she heard laughter coming from Oliver's room. She paused for a moment, smiling softly at the sound of his cheerful voice. As she was about to continue down the corridor, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. "Margaret's not just our maid," Oliver said proudly to his friends. "She's our hero." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of frustration or exhaustion. They were tears of validation. For so long, she had felt invisible, just another worker in the background of a grand life that wasn't hers. But hearing Oliver's words, she realized that her kindness, her courage, and her unwavering dedication had left an impact greater than she had ever expected. Word of Margaret's heroism had spread beyond the mansion walls. The local community recognized her bravery, and soon she was invited to speak at small gatherings, sharing her story of perseverance and kindness. She spoke about the importance of integrity, the power of compassion, and how no act of kindness is ever too small. People listened, inspired by her journey from being overlooked to being celebrated. The Calloways, once distant and indifferent, had also changed in subtle ways. Mrs. Calloway, who had always been preoccupied with social events and appearances, now took the time to greet Margaret warmly each morning. Mr. Calloway, typically absorbed in his business affairs, had even asked for her input on hospitality arrangements for future events. Margaret no longer felt like just an employee. She felt like an integral part of the household, respected and acknowledged. One morning, as she sipped her coffee before heading to work, Margaret reflected on how far she had come. Her hands, once rough from endless scrubbing, now held textbooks and class notes. Her days, once filled with endless tasks, now held purpose and the promise of something greater. Looking at Daniel across the table, sketching his latest design, she smiled. "You're going to be an incredible architect," she said. Daniel grinned back. "And you're going to be an amazing hotel manager, Mom." Margaret chuckled. "I guess we're both on our way, huh?" Their journey had been one of hardship, resilience, and quiet strength, but now it was a journey of hope and new beginnings. Margaret had proven to herself and to the world that courage knows no class, and kindness has the power to transform lives even within the grandest of mansions. And as she walked out the door that morning, she did so with her head held high, ready for whatever came next.